and welcome to Press Review with me, Carmen Cracknell. Today we'll be taking a look at the ongoing crisis in Syria and Egypt as we're joined by a member of the Labour Party, Omar Ismail. But first, let's begin by taking a look at the front pages here in the UK. The Guardian leads its front page reporting on the coalition rift deepening as the Business Secretary Vince Cable called on the Conservatives for an end to rhetoric and damaging cuts. It also features a picture of visitors in Durham enjoying a taste of Christmas in Edwardian style at an open-air museum. The Independent leads its front page reporting on Home Secretary Theresa May stepping up the use of citizenship stripping powers as a move to prevent the return of dual nationals who have gone to fight in Syria. The paper reports that since May 2010, she has removed the citizenship of 37 people. It also reports on Lib Dem's Vince Cable likening the Conservatives' panic about Romanian and Bulgarian migrants to Enoch Powell's River of Blood speech, and features a picture of the Royal Navy crew members enjoying an early Christmas dinner in the Antarctic. The Daily Telegraph also leads its front page reporting on the Lib Dem Conservative rift, reporting that Conservative MPs have described Cable's remarks as offensive and unacceptable. The paper also reports on parking fees and fines generating record profits of almost £600 million for councils in England last year, and features a picture of the Queen arriving in Sandringham ahead of the royal family Christmas. The Times leads its front page reporting on staff at one of Britain's biggest charities subjecting vulnerable care home residents to years of serious and systematic financial abuse. The paper also reports on accusations from Lib Dem's Cable to the Conservative Party and features a picture of the Christmas fair at London's South Bank. Now let's take a look at the top stories in the Middle East. As several key Egyptian activists have been detained in Egypt, let's take a look at what analysts are saying about the current situation in the country. The International New York Times features an article by the editorial board titled "Dark Days in Egypt," saying last week Egypt's military dictator stormed the offices of a prominent human rights organisation and charged Mohamed Morsi, the deposed president, with participating in a fantastical terrorist plot. The author writes, "The news from Egypt has become so unrelentingly bad that it is difficult to see how this nation can recover from a self-inflicted spiral of repression, violence and paranoia." The human rights group, the Egyptian Center for Economic and Social Rights, was targeted in a crackdown. The article says heavily armed state security agents detained and beat staff members of the organisation during a 9-hour ordeal. They eventually released all of them except Mohamed Ardel, a key member of the April 6th movement that helped mobilise the uprising against Hosni Mubarak almost 3 years ago. The article also said the authorities filed new criminal charges against Mr. Morsi, the democratically elected president who has been detained since he was deposed on July the 3rd, accusing him of a plot that involved killing protesters and leaking state secrets to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Meanwhile, the Committee to Protect Journalists listed Egypt as the 9th worst offender for jailing journalists in 2013. The author concludes that because the United States considers Egypt crucial to regional stability and because of Egypt's peace treaty with Israel, the Senate approved legislation that would make it easier to resume aid, which was largely suspended after Mr. Morsi was deposed. The generals are almost certain to interpret that as an endorsement of their authoritarian methods. The Telegraph features an article titled "Egypt Jails Key 2011 Activist for 3 Years for Protest" by Richard Spencer, regarding the controversial new protest law, which was implemented against 3 key activists in the 2011 revolution. Spencer describes the sentences as highly symbolic, saying the sentences were the maximum available and shocked Cairo's large political activist community. Ahmed Mahir founded and led the April 6th youth movement, which played the most prominent role in coordinating the Tahrir Square demonstrations that led to the downfall of ex-President Hosni Mubarak, while the other 2 activists were also high-profile spokesmen from the secular wing of the anti-military dictatorship campaign. Spencer says that although the new army-led coalition claims to be acting in the spirit of the 2011 revolution, it did not wait for a new constitution or for parliamentary and presidential elections before introducing, in the space of 2 weeks, legislation to ban further protests without prior approval from the authorities. In reaction to the charges, a Human Rights Legal Committee member said this is a very heavy sentence considering the charges. The new law is a warning light that the regime is attempting to use legal means to silence the opposition, especially the youth groups who played a leading role in the revolution but did not join the June 30th alliance. Spencer writes, the authorities have justified the new law, saying it is needed to bring an end to the continual disruption caused to Cairo and other cities by anti-government protesters. Spencer concludes the speed of the three men's conviction and sentence less than a month after the protest over which they were arrested contrasts with the usually slow pace of Egyptian justice. The case against Mr. Mubarak himself for complicity in the murder of protesters during the revolution is still being heard nearly 3 years later. Daily News Egypt features an opinion piece by Ziad al-Aql titled "The Truth About the Constitution." Aql says that during the 4 days from the 30th of June to 3rd of July, there was a unique consensus in Egypt on the absolute necessity of removing Morsi and the Brotherhood from office since they were a serious threat to the stability and security of this country. Regarding the 4 days following June 30th, Aql says everything that came afterwards never saw the same magnitude of consensus. The direction we went and the policies we adopted were not the choice of the millions who took to the streets challenging Morsi and the Brotherhood for 4 days. They were specifically the choice of the elite that was created after those 4 days were over, and the Constitution is the first tangible product this elite introduces. Aql writes, for the June coalition and its major supporters, the army, police and judiciary, the Constitution is much more than a political document, and the referendum is much more than a political process. He writes that in general the Constitution does provide a higher ceiling of rights and freedoms without real tangible guarantees. It leaves a lot of matters to be regulated by the law afterwards, which naturally leaves the principles preached by the Constitution to be a function of the Legislative Council present. No doubt it mentions minorities like women, Copts and Nubians, but it does not specify what exactly proper representation it promises those minorities is. He adds, finally, there is an enormous room left for the three core institutions, military, police and judiciary, room that will always reflect the balance of powers in Egypt while this constitution was being drafted. Aql writes, the referendum is merely a procedural necessity, but its outcome is not even prone to doubt. The dimensions of the new regime have already been envisioned, the institutions that shall retain power have already been selected, and the individuals that will constitute the elite have already been chosen. Aql concludes, however, what the West does not seem to understand so far is that the conflict is no longer a military brotherhood one, neither is it a question of democracy and equality. It's really a strictly local Egyptian political battle between the traditional forces that have always been there, and its outcome is a matter of resources rather than one of actual change. Joining us today on the show is Labour Party member Omar Ismail. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Ismail.
No problem, pleasure.
Given recent events and the new enactment of the protest law, in your opinion, is Egypt entering another era of authoritarianism?
I don't think so. I think Egypt at the moment is going through a period of time where everything is up in the air in regard of the political, non-political settlement in the country. Egypt is going through a period of finding the route, or at least establishing a roadmap that was agreed by the majority of people in July of 2013. So I think, given that the government at the moment is just a caretaker government, one cannot take an objective view of what's happening in Egypt. However, a number of things have happened which anybody that do believe in democracy will feel uncomfortable with.
Sure, and how do you think the Egyptian people will react to the news of prominent activists being arrested?
Well, you're referring to the 6th of April. I mean, the 6th of April movement really is trying to establish itself as a voice for the Egyptian people, and I think there are many many avenues where the Egyptian people can actually exercise that. The 6th of April movement is quite an enigma in my view, because it got involved with things that had nothing to do with what's happened in Egypt in some cases. So I'm quite sort of sitting on the fence on that one. 6th of April does not represent, again in my view, represent the majority of the democratic process in Egypt. Mm. It is an organization, in my view, that for some reason has gained prominence during Hosni Mubarak and continued, but it doesn't represent a political organization. It's just an opposition for anything that the movement itself feel it does not like. I think Egypt needs some sort of a law that organizes the relationship between the state and the people. And if anybody, including the 6th of April movement, are not happy with the enactment of the new law, then there are a process to go through it. And while it is not clear what the process are at the moment, I think they would be well advised to actually hold fire and wait until the political institutes have been elected, and they can take their grievances through that avenue.
And despite all these events, do you think that the original goal of democracy is achievable in Egypt?
I think so. I wouldn't for one moment, given what happened in the 25th of January, and that the fact that the Egyptian people have broken the wall of fear, and brought down the wall of fear, would sit back and allow another entity, whatever that entity may be, to act or behave in such a dictatorial way, albeit the army, the Muslim Brotherhood. I think there is an example there. When the Egyptian people felt that the Muslim Brotherhood actually were no better than Hosni Mubarak or his regime, they came out and supported it. We're not going to enter enter in this argument whether it is a coup or a revolution. I would refer to it as that the people spoke. The people have felt the country is in danger of going through another period of autocracy.
Yeah, very interesting points there. Thank you for your time, Mr. Ismail.
Pleasure.
Thanks. With just under 1 month left for the Geneva II conference, let's take a look at what is in today's press. Ahmad Arabi Ba'aj writes an analysis for the Syria Times titled Geneva II, a battle against terrorism. Ba'aj says that despite all the UN's statements about the drafting of the invitations to attend the Geneva II conference regarding the crisis in Syria, any observer for the current events and the daily statements of the concerned parties about the conference will understand very well that the road to Geneva II is still difficult and bumpy. He adds that indeed the Syrian government is seeking a political solution to resolve the crisis, and many countries that want to settle peace in Syria support this solution, such as Russia, China and Iran. But other countries such as America, Britain, France and some regional allies are seeking to thwart a political solution by their strong intention to support terrorism in Syria. Referring to a statement by US Secretary of State John Kerry in which he fears that the Geneva II conference may not succeed under current circumstances, Ba'aj says that it is obvious that the Syrian government repeatedly expressed its readiness to attend the Geneva II conference without preconditions. Then who is responsible for these obstacles which Mr. Kerry talked about? Baaj concludes that Mr. Kerry must be convinced that the obstacles facing the political solution of the crisis in Syria are made by the US. Thus, the US's allies in the region as a whole are practicing and supporting terrorism to hinder the political solution in Syria. The US and its allies have no interest as to stop terrorism because they are sure that it may lead to Geneva too, the main object of which is combating terrorism. AlMonitor has an article looking at the role of Iran and Saudi in Geneva too in its article Iran-Saudi Arabia Key to Syria Peace Conference. It writes that this week the Islamic Front refused to meet with US Ambassador to Syria Robert Ford, and Ford, despite the snub, said, "We are ready to sit with them because we talk to all parties and political groups in Syria." One might question whether Ford should be asking for a meeting with the Islamic Front, especially after being stiffed. The Islamic Front welcomes foreign fighters and supports Islamic law in Syria. Its rise at the expense of the Western-backed Free Syrian Army is the result of Saudi backing and finance. It says that instead of hoping for a sit-down with those who want a Sharia future for Syria, US diplomacy might be better focused on persuading Riyadh to rein in its Syrian jihadist allies and adhere to a ceasefire, if one can even be negotiated at this point. This is the only conversation the United States should be having about the Islamic Front or other jihadist groups operating there, and it is to be had with Saudi Arabia, not the Front. It adds that United States should refocus on engaging secular opposition figures, especially those inside Syria, who would be well positioned to play a bridging role in a transition, and who have been sidelined by the machinations and largesse of regional parties. The article also points out that Lakhdar Brahimi, the UN Arab League Special Representative for Syria, and representatives of the permanent members of the UN Security Council agreed that Saudi Arabia would be invited to Geneva too, although the US continues to block Iran's participation in the conference. It concludes by emphasising that time and again it has said there is no ceasefire or transition in Syria without Iran. If the purpose of Geneva too is to stop the war and negotiate a political transition, it's not clear how this objective is served by keeping out Iran, Syria's #1 ally. Iran on the outside would have no investment in a successful outcome. Keeping Iran out of Geneva too is probably money in the bank for a stalemated or unsuccessful conference. Former US President Jimmy Carter and American University's Professor Robert Pastor write an article in the Washington Post headlined "Time to be bold and make peace in Syria." They say that the war among Syria's sectarian groups has become more brutal. It's time to ask why the calls for peace have been fruitless. Carter and Pastor say that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's opponents have insisted that the goal of the Geneva conference is to replace his government. Sometimes he rejects. His government demands that the increasingly fragmented opposition groups, all of whom it classifies as terrorists, put down their weapons before they can discuss peace. In light of that fragmented opposition, they say that the UN has been fortunate to have two brilliant special envoys dealing with Syria, Kofi Annan and Lakhdar Brahimi, but they have not been permitted to use their negotiating skills because the principal actors insist on preconditions of victory rather than mutual accommodation essential to bringing the war to an end. Carter and Pastor note that everyone will need to make hard compromises if they want to end the war. If they fail to take these difficult steps, the war may very well go on for another decade and likely create a wider circle of destruction and death. According to Carter and Pastor, there should be three principles on which to base the discussions in Geneva. The first, they say, is that the Syrian people should decide on the country's future government in a free election process under the unrestricted supervision of the international community and responsible NGOs, with the result accepted if the elections are judged free and fair. The second principle, they state, is to assure and guarantee respect for all sectarian and minority groups, and the third is to ensure the first two goals are achieved. It adds that these preconditions should not be controversial, but they mean that Syrian factions and their supporters would have to back down from their former unreasonable demands. Now let's take a look at the top headlines from international papers. Russia's Moscow Times leads its front page with the headline, Khodorkovsky has no plans to return. The International New York Times leads its front page with the headline, For World Cup, booking a stay in a slum. UAE's Gulf News leads its front page with the headline, Erdogan defiant in face of new crisis. And finally, China's Global Times leads its front page with the headline, Ties sour in Abe's first year. For more updates, please visit levant.tv. That's all we have time for today. Please join us again next time for another press review. Goodbye.